Wonderful day, wonderful day, wonderful day indeed. This right here is your neighborhood sensei Fouché. And I always begin my shows by first strongly suggesting, because a lot of folks don't like being told what to do. True indeed. So moving forward in conversation, I most emphatically implore for all of you beautiful, wonderful, self-loving, worthy individuals to stay woke. But in the process, never get all stressed out. You know what I'm saying? Make sure you take all necessary meditative practices and procedures to relax. And always, 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 always be prepared to take those notes. I had to pull out the big binder on y'all, you know what I'm saying? Because we have some information we're going to cover as always, you know. And we're getting into our political side of information right now, you know what I'm saying? Because all this stuff is relative, you know. And I was speaking to a gentleman earlier that has a strong interest in assisting me in what I'm trying to accomplish, you know. And when I was explaining stay woke to him in the shortest amount of time, I really couldn't cover specifically, you know, what this really represents, you know what I'm saying? Because when I mentioned mental health, he started to kind of go into a specific direction of connection, you know, networking with, you know, a specific gentleman. And not to say that, you know, it wouldn't hold any particular value, you know, but I didn't want to be misquoted and misunderstood as far as, you know, what I call chop it up. You know what I'm saying? Because what we doing over here is just chopping it up. You know, barbershop talk, as some might call it, or, you know, just street conversation, you know, between wise intellects, you know. And that's just, you know, dropping mathematics, you know what I'm saying, and knowledge and wisdom, you know, amongst our community, you know. So, you know, we could cover a lot of different things. What we're not gonna really cover is sports. Like, everything here is gonna be more high level intellectual, you know, because a lot of us, we used to be, you know, either we're trying to walk a certain path and we're confused on how to get there, you know what I'm saying, or we're already in line with that path and we're finding avenues that assist us best in our process moving forward, you know what I'm saying. So right over here with the neighborhood sensei Fouché, with this stay woke, this is more of the intellectual platform of what we're trying to accomplish. And what we're gonna get to soon is the chop it up with Sensei Fouché, which is just basically, you know, exchange, you know, just common questions in relation to everyday situations or events, current events, you know what I'm saying? So I just want to be more it'll be more opinionated on the chop it up. But right here, we choose to make this specifically informative, you know what I'm saying? Because it's all about the information. And a lot of us, you know, we still living our life left back, you know, still immature, you know, trying to figure out why we're not getting anywhere. But realistically, instead of experiencing life as well as different atmosphere, you know, we running in a treadmill, on a treadmill, metaphorically speaking, when it comes to the relation of how we move. You know what I'm saying? So you need to step up your game and stop clowning around and start being more educated and informative into what's happening. You know what I'm saying? And stop living the life like we in junior high school, you know what I'm saying? We need to be more on a master's level of life, you know what I'm saying? Basically, above level collegiate. Today is the 12th of November, of 2025 here in the States of America, where I'm located, it is 17:09 in the afternoon. And that's for 24-hour familiar timekeepers. You know what I'm saying? For all of the generic, 5:04 in the late afternoon, early evening. You know what I'm saying? Time already shifted to where we fall back, so it's getting darker at an earlier time. So all that being said, I want to really get into some information because I'm not sure how much time we're going to cover, and we're going to let it loose. You know what I'm saying? It's funny because if you notice me and my t-shirts, I usually have messages with my t-shirts for specific reasons. You know what I'm saying? And today we're gonna let go. We're gonna let it out. You know what I'm saying? Because there's a lot of folks that are misperceived on the history, the true history of specific figures. You know what I'm saying? So we gonna, and I'm gonna stand up for a quick minute because I have my Sesame Street, Oscar the Grouch, you know what I'm saying? And we gonna open up the trash and we about to expose some trash. You know what I'm saying? And that's no disrespect as far as me being an American and having pride amongst my fellow citizens as far as, the privileges and freedoms that, we represent and that our military fight for, and our representatives are supposed to keep and hold and honor for us. You know what I'm saying? But in these days and times, you got bait and switch and a lot of con men, trying to, run game and not be extremely informative, but be shadowy and shady in how they share, as well as make available specific important information for all types of people instead of massaging the hurt egos of specific types of people due to the truth. You know what I'm saying? Due to their malicious behavior and their very suspect history when it comes to stating how godly they are and how caring they claim to be for mankind. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, we're going into our whenever was America great? You know what I'm saying? And in this episode, we're going to cover, it's called From Colonials into a Confederate Union. And this is basically going into mainly the story and the background of Thomas Jefferson. He was the writer, as we well know, of the Declaration of Independence, which basically was a drafted document given to, the British imperialists or the Parliament in letting them know that we now are putting you on notice that we choose to separate from being underneath your control or your leadership. You know what I'm saying? So let's get into some information, because we have a lot of things that we're going to cover. You know what I'm saying? So if you really want to have factual information, you know what I'm saying, stay right here. If you want to, clown around, you know what I'm saying, you could just slide over and do something else and stay left back in life. You know what I'm saying? Always trying to figure out how to catch up to the current moment. So let's get to it. So we're going to start over in 1606. You know what I'm saying? 1606 was the year King James I of England, you know what I'm saying? The King of England at that time granted charters to both the Plymouth Company and the London Company to establish colonized settlements here in North America. A year later, the London Company established a permanent colony at Jamestown, Virginia, on the Chesapeake Bay. By 1743, and let me hold up a second, you know what I'm saying? Because there was a lot of struggle that was going on when it came to the initial colonists coming over here to North America. You know, everything wasn't, you know, sunny and rosy, you know, in the inception. I mean, there was a lot of different wars that was going on, you know, between the settlers and the natives, as well as, you know, England and all of its rival countries over in Europe. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, let's not act like, you know, from the beginning, everybody came over here and, you know, we have Thanksgiving coming up. So all of a sudden, you know, they came over in the Mayflower, the Santa Maria and the Pinta, and was like, hey, you know, welcome to America, because they, you know, the natives didn't even call it America, but welcome to America, and hey, we're glad you came. You know what I'm saying? Let's break some bread and cook some turkey. You know what I'm saying? Matter of fact, that traditional meal wasn't even set in place as we know it until about, what, three centuries later? We figure in the early 1900s, 3 centuries later, you know what I'm saying, you wind up having what we now know as the traditional Thanksgiving meal. So anyway, so if we start to go into further into our reading, by 1743, the colonies are still under British rule, right? You know what I'm saying? So let's do some math a little bit. That's 137 years, you know, past the initial settlement, you know, into the colonies. You know, Britain still has rule over the colonies. You know, and like I said, everything wasn't all rosy where everybody got along, because in between there was a lot of beef, you know what I'm saying, or a lot of resentment starting to fester as time started to move forward. Thomas Jefferson is born at Shadwell Plantation to a prosperous first family with a tobacco plantation in rural Virginia. His father was a surveyor who was well connected in business, also having political influence. Thomas admired his father. Of course, you know, he looked up to him. You know what I'm saying? I looked up to my dad when, you know, I was young. You know, every boy that, you know, grows up with a father, you know, more than most likely idolizes their father. And he's provided a great education, and he's always around elite privilege growing up and engaging in politics, because there was a lot of, you know, political people that were involved with his dad, and he was always in these circles in some form of fashion. So, he kind of grew up, in business and politics pretty much all his life. His father owned a lot of slaves, most slaves in the county, to be most specific. Thomas grew up owning slaves as well as all of his siblings, who were granted a personal slave of the same sex and appropriate same age as them, soon after they were born. Everything was pretty much arranged a little bit before birth and upon birth. And that's the way things operated in elite classes, back in those times. Pardon me, drop my water, so let's keep that up top. The bonded, as far as the slaves on his father's plantation, outnumbered the masters from 6-1 in ratio. So for every 6 slaves, there was 1 master. You know what I'm saying? This hypocritical life contradicts his declaration of independence ideology. And we're going to get into that, a little bit in a minute after we get into a little bit of some further reading. Thomas's father dies when he is 14. And I'm probably not going to pause for a minute, so, just bear with me. He inherits all his father's estate and is obligated with being the pillar of his family. In 1760, at the age of 16, he enrolls in William and Mary, which is a very prestigious college in Williamsburg, Virginia, the second oldest college dating from the original colonies. Here he meets William Small, a professor and follower of a group called the Enlightenment, which was founded in prior century Europe and was comprised of philosophers and scientists who followed ideologies of reason and logic, as opposed to the conservative religious Protestants and Catholics over in Europe. William Small is an early mentor and introduces him to Governor Francis Farquhar of Virginia. And a lot of the enlightened philosophies, were coming pretty much out of France at that time. You know what I'm saying? And if we went into, ancient Rome, they understood a level of enlightenment when we talk about like Aristotle and Socrates, to be most specific. And there were a lot of scholars in between, but this information continued to process forward as time evolved, just passing from generation to generation. Through his studies of law, George Wythe soon after becomes another mentor. They frequently discussed freedom from Britain within the elite class while being served by enslaved people. They're talking about freedom, and here they are whining and dining, you know what I'm saying, being served by slaves. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't like these folks were getting paid by them. They was in service of them, and they're over here, keying it up about, freedom and prosperity for all, and they're over here being served and entertained by the slaves that they control. Very hypocritical. In 1769, and let's pause for a second because I wanted to go into some reading from the internet just to kind of connect some dots. So right now we pretty much in 1760, right? So after succeeding his brother in 1685, and we're going to go back a little bit in order to move forward, King James II and his lieutenant, because they said, King James I was the one who allowed for the original settlement to take place and the colonies to form over here in the States of America as we know it now. So King James II and his lieutenant, Edmund Andros, sought to assert the crown's authority over colonial affairs, right? This is where the static is going to start to escalate. James was deposed by the new joint monarchy of William and Mary in the Glorious Revolution. But William and Mary quickly reinstated many of James's colonial policies. You know what I'm saying? So being that there was already a level of aggression that was being asserted by the British imperialists, the colonial leaders wanted to just kind of play it cool. So, they decided to not rock the boat. So the colonial policies was reinstated, including the Mercantilist Navigation Acts and the Board of Trade. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, and the province of Maine were incorporated into the province of Massachusetts Bay, and New York and the Massachusetts Bay Colony were reorganized as royal colonies. So instead of being like independent and having their own rules, they had to kind of fall back in line of that British imperialism, with a governor appointed by the king. You know what I'm saying? So again, the king said, I'm appointing my people, as opposed to you guys voting your own people. I'm gonna dictate for my people to take control of this, that, and the other. Isn't that what we kind of have going on now in our current state of politics here in the States of America with this POTUS? He wants to force specific people to advocate for us instead of us vote and choose who we want to represent us. Maryland, which had experienced a revolution against the Calvert family, also became a royal colony. You know what I'm saying? So eventually they had to cave in. So Maryland already started to, fight back, and, they already were compromised. You know what I'm saying? Even those colonies that retained their charters or proprietors were forced to assent to much greater royal control than had existed before the 1690s. You know what I'm saying? So before 100 years of colonization, there was already, this extreme need for the ruler of Britain now, which is the original king that allowed the settlement, King James I. His brother, King James II, is now being a whole lot more aggressive in his control of the states of America, or the colonies, you know what I'm saying, at the time. Between immigration, the importation of slaves, and natural population growth, the colonial population in British North America grew immensely in the 18th century. According to historian Alan Taylor, the population of the 13 colonies stood at 1.5 million by 1750. You know what I'm saying? So in 141 years, the population grew pretty much to 1.5 million people. You know what I'm saying? Which I don't have the numbers in front of me right now as far as the amount of people in the original colonization. You know what I'm saying? But it increased substantially in a little less than 150 years. More than 90% of the colonists lived as farmers, right? All of them were pretty much agriculture, except for a few main cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, which were basically like, high class towns, as far as back in those days, not the metropolises that we see today, but, most of the land was basically, farmland, and then you had the cities were way smaller, but more extravagant than, your farm. I mean, for me, I remember growing up watching the old school show Little House on the Prairie. And that would be, a good representation of how, main cities operated way back in the days. With the defeat of the Dutch and the imposition of the Navigation Acts, the British colonies in North America became part of the global British trading network. The colonists traded foodstuffs, wood, tobacco, and various other resources for Asian tea, West Indian coffee, and West Indian sugar, among other items. Native Americans, far from the Atlantic coast, supplied the Atlantic market with beaver fur and deerskins and sought to preserve their independence by maintaining a balance of power between the French and the English. By 1770, the economic output of the 13 colonies made up 40% of the gross domestic product of the British Empire. You know what I'm saying? So 40%, of British finances were coming from American production, you know what I'm saying, or American trade. Prior to 1660, almost all immigrants to the English colonies of North America had migrated freely, though most paid for their passage by becoming indentured servants, you know what I'm saying, which were basically slaves, you know what I'm saying. So aside from, the transatlantic slave, you also had white slaves, you know what I'm saying, Caucasian slaves, which were people that wanted to come to America but didn't have the finances or funds, so someone financed the money for them to come to America, or, it was basically borrowing money, you know what I'm saying, and to pay back that money, they had to be in service of so-and-so for X amount of time until they were able to buy back their freedom, and they had the opportunity to do that, as opposed to, people of dark skin or color who didn't have that opportunity to buy their freedom. They were just enslaved for their entire life. Improved economic conditions and an easing of religious persecution in Europe made it increasingly difficult to recruit labor to the colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries. So basically, there was so much aggression, as also from a religious standpoint, where freedoms were basically being restricted, you know what I'm saying, and you were being controlled and forced into following a certain belief and a way of life. Partly due to this shortage of free labor, the population of slaves in British North America grew dramatically between 1680 and 1750. The growth was driven by a mixture of forced immigration and the reproduction of slaves. In the southern colonies, which increasingly wealthy elites, which relied most heavily on slave labor, in the southern colonies, which relied mostly heavily on slave labor, the slaves supported vast plantation economies lorded over by increasingly wealthy elites, as I was stating before. By 1775, slaves made up 1/5 of the population in the 13 colonies, but they didn't have any rights or was truly represented. You know what I'm saying? But less than 10% of the population of the middle colonies in the New England after 1700. Oh, my fault. So let me go over. By 1775, slaves made up 1/5 of the population of the 13 colonies, though a smaller proportion of the English population migrated to British North America. After 1700, the colonies attracted new immigrants from other European countries, right? So aside from England, other countries, including Catholics from Ireland, Protestant Germans, also started to arrive. You know what I'm saying? And I want to say they started to migrate more towards that Ohio or, North Central America. You know what I'm saying? But don't document me on this specific conversation with that information. But trust me, it's going to come. As the 18th century progressed, colonists began to settle far from the Atlantic coast, going into Pennsylvania, Virginia, Connecticut, and Maryland. All lay claim to the land in the Ohio River Valley. So like I said, they were starting to push up because once you go into that northern New York, then you'll be over in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, all of those states right there in that area, especially when you go down into Pennsylvania and you're in northern Pennsylvania, you'll be right into that southern tip of Ohio, right? So like they was continuing as I'm reading, the colonies engaged in a scramble to expand west. There's a lot of folks that are starting to come over here and it's starting to become a whole lot more populated. And they want to be able to have space in order to create revenue and income. You know what I'm saying? And that's as far as, Britain and, the rest of these countries, that are now allowing for a migration to take place. So let's go back to, my note reading over here. So in 1769, at 26 years old, Thomas is elected to the Virginia House of Burgess, a position granted to those of entitlement and privilege. And if you followed my reading from prior, there was, let me start to go over here. I should have read over here first. The British subjects of North America believed the unwritten British Constitution protected their rights and that the governmental system with the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the monarch sharing power found an ideal balance among democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. However, the British were saddled with huge debts following the French and Indian War. They were entrenched in so much conflict, that they needed revenue, and they, like I was stating before, that's when there starts to become a whole lot more conflict within their relationship with the colonists, because they start to tax them and impose, these extreme laws, which really start to suck not only their finances dry, but they start to minimize the amount of land that they are able to own, because now they're relinquishing this land to their to the troops and the military. Because a lot of the military wound up staying over here in order to keep a security for, the British imperialism to continue. So the British leaders felt that the colonies should contribute more funds, being that these wars were to keep them, safe, from the way that they tell the story. It wasn't like the colonists told Britain, like, save us, even though I'm sure that, they were cool with the fact that they didn't have to do a lot of the, physical fighting themselves. You know what I'm saying? But I'm sure they would have did what they had to if they needed to. So the British leaders felt that the colonists should contribute more funds, and they began imposing taxes such as the Sugar Act of 1764. That's where I meant to go to before I started getting back into this reading. Increased British control of the 13 colonies upset the colonists and upended the notion many colonists held that they were equal partners in the British Empire, right? You see what we have going on in the States in these days, where, the person in charge thinks that he owns us as opposed to, basically leads us. You know what I'm saying? Because this is supposed to be a land of the people, not a land for the president. He just leads, or is the leading representative for the laws of the people. Meanwhile, seeking to avoid another expensive war with Native Americans, Britain issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which restricted settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So they started to, minimize how far you could expand, the colonization, and they had their own agendas. Believe me, we ain't going to go there yet. However, it was effectively replaced 5 years later thanks to the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. And we're not going to go into the specifics at this moment, but you could look it up. The 13 colonies became increasingly supportive or divided. The 13 colonies became increasingly divided between patriots opposed to parliamentary taxation without representation and loyalists. Right? That's what we got going on. The loyalists with the whole MAGA thing. You know what I'm saying? And then we have on the other side, which is similar, would be the patriots. You know what I'm saying? But the loyalists who supported the king. In the British colonies nearest to the 13 colonies, however, Protestants were muted, as most colonists accepted the new taxes. You know what I'm saying? These provinces had smaller populations, were largely dependent on the British military, and had less of a tradition of self-rule. Now, here in these states of America, a lot of the red states depend on the blue states. So they depend on the government for their funding, because a lot of the blue states provide the main funding for the government. And you can look this up because that's pretty much fact. You know what I'm saying? So a lot of the red states, in comparison, have a very conservative view and are extremely dependent on conservative leadership to help them out, or, for them to have some form of a messiah and a higher belief of faith in, as far as being their savior. You know what I'm saying? They need a daddy, because they're always going to be children psychologically. So back to my notes. In 1769, at 26 years old, Thomas is elected to the Virginia House of Burgess, a position granted to those of entitlement and privilege. Virginia just finished 7 years of 2 wars, beginning with the French and ending with the indigenous of the East Coast. After a ceasefire, the British troops stay. To compensate for military wages, land titles and agreements by rule are relinquished from the colonists, to compensate the British troops' loyalty. Colonists' loyalty to British Parliament diminishes after generational ties lessen within time and distance between coasts of the sea, kind of has the British Parliament out of touch with the strongest feelings by the colonists. Thomas was not a strong orator and still a shell from his future self. In 1769, he and his cousin proposed a bill at the House of Burgess to shift control of slave emancipation from the general court directly to the slave owners. Right? So basically, the colonists wanted to control the way and the laws of not only the slaves, but the trading of the slaves or the ownership of the slaves. They no longer, needed or wanted the middleman. You know what I'm saying? They wanted to eliminate the middleman and just kind of create their own need and income from slavery. The bill was allegedly killed immediately after introduction. You know what I'm saying? And this is because a lot of these folks didn't want to rock the boat, when it came to following British the British laws. We'll just keep it simple. This is not officially documented, but noted in his autobiography. Scholars believe this is to be made up to mask his inclusion and ownership of slave practice. In 1770, Thomas starts to build an estate at Monticello Mountain, 5 miles from his birthplace. Upon knowing a man named John Wales, he meets, then marries his wife, who is John Wales's daughter. Martha's first husband died 2 years earlier, so his wife was Martha. Soon after, John Wales dies himself, leaving an estate consisting of 11,000 acres of land and 135 slaves. You know what I'm saying? This is the writer of the Declaration of Independence. You know what I'm saying? The speaker of freedom, the grandfather of freedom. You know what I'm saying? He keeps enslaved people. And then when he has a chance to try to allow for these slaves to be out of service, he continues to have them under service. John Wales also fathered 6 of his 12 children with his mistress, who was a slave, Betty Hemmings. Half of the slave siblings are treated with more privilege than the normal brutality that, any field slave would have. Usually your house slaves were treated with a little bit more courtesy than your field slaves, you know what I'm saying, to call it that. Like basically you got to, eat a little bit better and be a little bit more protected inside of the house as far as, from the outside conditions and the elements, and be able to wear, better clothes. You know what I'm saying? But you were still a slave. By this time, Britain is at war with France again, the Netherlands and Spain, having revenue issues and needing to continue war funding. The British Parliament imposes 4 major taxes. The Stamp Act in 1765 being lastly the most notable. The elite leaders of the colonies fear the loss of their autonomy to the British Parliament, which was the true pulse to the revolution. You know what I'm saying? The revolution was mostly aligned with the rich, not the poor. You know what I'm saying? Because these elite people here in the colonies, wanted to keep their money and cut out the middleman. Like they're like, yo, all these different added rules and taxes that you're trying to take from us, we're not in agreement with that. I mean, the poor don't have nothing, you know what I'm saying? So they're basically extremely dependent and on, the British Parliament or the imperialism, you know what I'm saying? And they're afraid because if they don't have, daddy to take care of them, are they going to be able to survive? The people with money is like, yo, we could take care of ourselves, you know what I'm saying? Because we understand, profit, finances, and trade, and we have revenue to behind us. All we need to do is to, ratify a constitution and form a government. You know what I'm saying? In 1773, the Boston Tea Party happens. You know what I'm saying? The resentment is starting to grow. The Sons of Liberty, even more, because there was already resentment. The Sons of Liberty masquerade, these cowards, as natives when attacking the British. So that way the British think that it's the natives and start to go and have beef with the natives. And if they weaken the British military, they figure they could slowly start to train themselves and have more power and overtake, the British control. In 1774, by response for this Boston Tea Party failure, the Intolerable Acts are created to curtail independence from the British government. Like, yo, all this resistance, we ain't having that. You know what I'm saying? So we are gonna punish you, right? Isn't that what the POTUS now is doing? He just tried to do that with the SNAP benefits. You know what I'm saying? He's already gonna eliminate a lot of health care for folks because the cost of these premiums are about to skyrocket. As much as they deny it, the information's already out there. You know what I'm saying? But we ain't gonna talk about that. Let's continue forward. This inspires a statement letter called the Declaration of Rights, written to all other colonies at the Virginia Convention of 1774. Before this, the colony states interacted rarely with each other. You know what I'm saying? Like Britain didn't want them to all, congregate with one another. You know what I'm saying? Because the more they realize together that they're all being taken advantage of, that's gonna be a sooner moment for there to be a revolt, which eventually is coming, as we know. Before this, they rarely interacted with each other. Massachusetts included a letter of explanation to the revolt labeled as the Boston Tea Party. For their losses suffered during the revolt, a proposition of prayer and fasting is requested among the civilians, then agreed upon amongst the colony leaders on June 1st. You know what I'm saying? They're like, yo, we're going to be in mourning because, this revolt that we tried to be assertive in, it didn't really go so well, and we lost some folks. So, we want to have a few days to, kind of mourn our losses. British Parliament labels this an act of rebellion, and more British troops are dispatched to the colonies. Thomas is voted governor of Virginia, and the fight nears Virginia, right? Tick, tick, tock, clock is ticking. Next comes the Quartering Acts. Britain is really like, yo, and this is similar to right now where you have the National Guard going into these blue cities, right? So check this out. The Quartering Acts. British troops stationed inside the colonist residence. You know what I'm saying? This act was in practice earlier in an agreement from 1765 to 1770. You know what I'm saying? But the act expired. A new act was updated as part of the Intolerable Acts in 1774. So they already did it. And then, once the act expired, they kind of calmed down. As we was reading before, they still had British troops over here on the land in the states or in the colonies. You know what I'm saying? But now that there was a revolt, starting to starting to gravitate, then they were like, yo, you guys are already on over there, so now we want you to monitor every single home. There we go, right? This leads to a first Continental Congress that September, right? Yeah, let me get my reading straight. So, a Continental Congress happens that September in Philadelphia in 1774. Thomas Jefferson was not allowed to attend, but wrote what is known as a summary view of the rights of British America. The letter was delivered by Thomas's personal slave, Jupiter Evans. The goal at first was not of independence, right, but an agreeable compromise, right? Because they probably didn't want to, go to war because there was going to be a lot of casualties, you know what I'm saying? And money, and wars cost money. And, rich folks are about trying to keep their money, not lose it. The Sons of Liberty agenda was not favored by the poor. You know what I'm saying? Because the poor are like, yo, we don't have nothing. If you take away daddy, like, are you going to take care of us? Because we're not sure if you're capable of doing that. They hardly had any dispute with the agreements established by the British Parliament, right? In 1775, tensions mount. The Sons of Liberty, they're like, yo, we want to keep more of our money. And the poor are like, we rely on their money. You know what I'm saying? They our daddy. Are you guys going to take care of us? In 1775, tensions mount. British military governor Thomas Gage soon abolishes the Massachusetts government and imposes martial law. This includes seizing all arms from civilians carried out by raids. This antagonizes the colonists and immediately surprise gunfire by the British ignite. That November 7th, 1775, Colonel Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunsmore, issues a proclamation requesting for all the African enslaved to take arms against their master colonists in exchange for freedom upon victory. Yeah, right. You know what I'm saying? Because they were desperate and they knew that the slaves didn't want to be slaves. So, propaganda promises. Hey, if you help us out, we'll think about helping you out. The slaves agreed to fight for the British, more than likely, because, they're like, hey, if you're going to hook us up, it's like the president right now, we're going to give you money. And if I give you money, you need to support me. You know what I'm saying? So the slaves rebelling caused a great concern to all the colonists, of course. So this committed full loyalty from most colonists in the rebellion of rich and poor. Because now the poor are going to be affected, because if the slaves rise up and they have a large number of population as well, it's a numbers game. And that numbers game is going to wind up, being in less favor of everyone, including the poor. You know what I'm saying? Because even the poor folks, have a level above these, people of color that are slaves. You know what I'm saying? And that puts them on the same level of these people, or they would be a level above and they would diminish beneath them. At a second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Thomas Jefferson this time attended. Most notable names also in attendance were George Washington, a military figure, of course, as we know, and John Adams, a close associate and friend to be. John Adams was contrast in personality to Jefferson, though Thomas was an extremely talented writer. In May 1776, the Virginia House of Delegates calls for a proclamation of independence to be drafted. On June 11th, 1776, the draft is started. A committee of 5 is appointed by John Hancock, consisting of Thomas Jefferson, who is the youngest, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston from New York, and Robert Sherman of Connecticut. By June 28th, 1776, the first draft is presented, then slightly condensed after review. Anti-slavery was detracted, along with statements blaming King George III for the common practice of slavery. You know what I'm saying? They didn't want to really rock the boat too much, so they were really careful about what they put into this declaration because they were hoping that things went smooth. You know what I'm saying? And putting the blame of slavery and basically, staining the king's reputation probably wasn't gonna, help accomplish, what they were hoping to succeed in. This is hypocritical due to the accepted practice by most colonial leaders with political influence. So, how are you gonna talk about, King George or feel a certain way about him allowing for slavery when you didn't have to agree to it? You know what I'm saying? But you agreed to it. So, that's hypocritical. After 21 days of adjustments, the now known final draft is approved, and on June 2nd, 1776, Declaration for Independence is given, and on July 4th, 1776, it is signed and ratified. So it was actually completed on the 2nd of June, and it was completely signed and agreed by everyone on the 4th. The colonists asked for aided assistance from the Spanish, Dutch, and French to align against their common British enemy. British had so much beef with so many other people over these years, and the colonists are like, yo, we need the numbers. And the enslaved already for the British, so they probably, were still salty about that and weren't going to include, the slaves. So they decided to include, all of these other European countries. You know what I'm saying? So, the Declaration of Independence. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's gods entitles them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And I'm reading the Declaration of Independence. And after we read this, we're going to end this conversation, because the Declaration of Independence is the foundation of what this country's laws and principles are founded on. You know what I'm saying? So that's why we're reading this, to see, where the hypocrisy stands even in today's day of government and psychological manipulation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? This is what Thomas Jefferson wrote. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experience have shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. Absolute despotism. It is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of the Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. It's a tongue twister. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly, for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of these people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative power, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. Let me read that over. Whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to present the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and amount and payment of their salaries. Again, he has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of legislatures. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, given his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. That's what ICE is doing. That's what the ICE agents are doing. For cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us, in many cases, of the benefits of trial by jury. You know what I'm saying? When they go through the deportation thing, they don't want to go through due process. For transporting us by seas to be tried for pretended offenses. Isn't that the Garcia case? That's in reference to that. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislature for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at the time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy perfidy. Let's look up perfidy right quick. Not like I had time, but we're going to make time. Perfidy. A deceitfulness, untrustworthiness. Scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. And let me read that over since I kind of fumbled it a little bit. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And that's extremely prejudicial. You know what I'm saying? In every state of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justices and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore, and we're going to look up consanguinity. Consanguinity. On that word tip again. Consanguinity. We'll go consanguine. Relating to or denoting people descended from the same ancestor. And I have to remember where I was. All right, I see where I was. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. And that was a complete sentence in how it was written by Mr. Thomas Jefferson. I had to read it over to be sure that I read the sentence correctly. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions to do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do, and for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And we are ending our reading right there. And I am going to not have a long, extended ending monologue. You know what I'm saying? I am going to state that this is your neighborhood Sensei Fouché until our next show. You know what I'm saying? I always first strongly suggest before emphatically imploring, because a lot of folks don't like being told what to do, true indeed. But I tell all of you, or hope for all of you, to stay woke. But in the process, never ever get all stressed out. You know what I'm saying? Make sure you always take any necessary meditative practices and procedures to relax. You know what I'm saying? And always, 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 always be prepared to take those notes. Until our next conversation, which will be part 2 of this, which is titled again. Let me go back to my page. Whenever was America great? Which is, our topic of reference. And this episode is from Colonials into a Confederate Union. And until our next episode, which will be the second part, be smooth in unity. 1.